Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're taking a closer look at a story you might think you already know.
A children's story.
Yeah, Oscar Wilde's The Selfish Giant. But
Ugh.
we're going beyond just reading it. We'll dig into what makes this story so powerful,
Yes.
so
So infinite.
compelling. Why is the giant so selfish? What's the deeper meaning of that garden?
And who is that little boy?
Exactly. We have an excerpt from the story itself to guide us, so let's dive in.
The Selfish Giant is fascinating because it works on so many levels. It's a children's story, sure, but it also makes you think about human nature, loss, and the chance for redemption.
Right. It starts off with this idyllic garden. Think like lush green grass,
Beautiful, fragrant flowers.
birds singing, kids playing, pure joy, right?
Exactly, and that's intentional.
Yeah.
Gardens in literature, they often symbolize paradise, untouched beauty and harmony.
Like the Garden of Eden.
Exactly.
But then this giant stomps in, fresh off a trip, and
That throws a
first
tantrum.
he builds a huge wall around the garden, kicks out all the kids. It's like, get out, mine.
It's interesting, isn't it? On the surface, he's just greedy, wants it all for himself. But what if it's something deeper?
Deeper.
What if it's fear?
Fear. That's an angle I hadn't thought about.
Think about it. He shuts everyone out, builds these walls, both literal and, figurative. Maybe it's not just about the garden, but about protecting himself
Protecting himself
from
from.
something. What do you think? What is he so afraid of?
Good question. Is it being hurt? Maybe losing control? He's so angry, it's like he's pushing something away.
And what happens because of his fear? Spring, summer, autumn, they pass him by. They won't enter the garden. It's his selfishness.
So only winter stays.
Yeah, the garden, once vibrant, becomes this desolate wasteland.
It's like his inner self is reflected in the garden. He's created his own personal winter, blocking out the warmth and life. Powerful imagery, right?
Absolutely. Makes you think about the gardens we might be shutting ourselves out of in our own lives. Joy, connection, creativity. What walls have we built? What are we missing out on? Because of our own fears.
Wow, that's kind of personal. I mean, it's easy to focus on the giant's mistakes, but we all have a bit of that selfish giant in us, right? Pushing people away, retreating into ourselves.
Right, but thankfully the story doesn't end there. One day, the giant hears this bird singing, a tiny spark of hope. He looks out, and the children are back in the garden,
They found a way in, and everything's alive again.
bursting with life.
Except for one little boy who's all alone and he can't climb a tree.
Ah,
And that's when the giant's heart starts to thaw. He sees the boy's sadness, feels remorse, and
and he realizes.
realizes how selfish he's been.
It's a beautiful moment, isn't it, that transformation?
Yeah.
He sees how his isolation has caused pain to himself and others, and that realization, that's what lets him change.
He helps a little boy into the tree, and it's like a literal thaw. The frost on the branches melts, and boom, the garden's full of children again.
It's amazing, isn't it? The power of just one act of kindness breaks the spell. The giant tears down that wall, welcomes them all back. He lets go of the fear, chooses connection over being alone. What do you think? Is it real change or just a moment of generosity?
I think it's more, he's had this epiphany. He sees the world differently now, understands what's really important, that connection.
You say value. We think of selfishness as wanting things for ourselves, but he had the whole garden and was miserable. Real value comes from sharing, from letting go.
That's a great point, but there's still a sadness. The little boy he helped, he never comes back. Why?
It is a bit of a mystery. Makes you wonder if the boy represents more than just a child.
Ooh, tell me more.
Well, he appears at these key moments, when the giant first shows his heart, and then later in a scene full of symbolism, almost like he's a catalyst for change, a guide.
And remember, he has marks on his hands and feet and says they're the marks of love. What's Wilde trying to tell us? It's such a powerful image, those marks of love. Love isn't always easy, is it?
Exactly. It challenges how we usually think about love. It's not always, perfect and happy.
Right.
Sometimes it involves wounds, scars, a willingness to give, even when it hurts.
And that little boy leads the giant to his own garden, a place where it's always springtime.
Right.
Could that be a metaphor for something bigger, like a spiritual paradise?
It's certainly possible.
Uh-huh.
It makes you think, if the giant's garden is like our earthly lives, with all its ups and downs, what does this other garden represent? What kind of paradise is waiting for us when we let go of selfishness?
Deep stuff. But going back to the garden as paradise, there's also a darker side, isn't there?
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, he shuts everyone out, trying to create this perfect, isolated world, but it becomes a wasteland. Makes me think how wanting control, wanting things to be perfect, can actually lead us away from real joy.
That's insightful. It's like he's trying to make paradise on his own terms, but real paradise, real happiness, can't exist if you're alone.
You need vulnerability, openness, let go of control. It's a reminder that sometimes the things we chase, possessions, status, can actually trap us, keep us from what really matters. Just like the giant's wall. He thought it was protecting him, but it was a prison.
It wasn't just the giant who changed, though. The garden itself transformed. How Wilde describes the trees, the flowers, it's like they're alive, celebrating the giant's change of heart.
They were rejoicing.
Right.
It's like nature itself is responding to his generosity. Our actions have consequences. Our inner world affects everything around us.
Absolutely. Makes you think about how we can cultivate our own gardens in our lives. Not literal ones, but spaces of beauty, kindness, connection. Our homes, our work, our communities. How do we tear down those walls and let love and joy grow?
Such a beautiful thought. And speaking of beauty, Wilde's writing is so simple yet powerful. He gets these big truths across in a way that's so easy to understand and so moving.
It's true. His language is almost childlike in how simple it is, but then there's all this imagery, symbolism that makes you think on a deeper level. He speaks right to your heart.
And there's a rhythm to it, a musicality. It draws you in. It's a short story, but it feels epic.
That's part of why it's so timeless. It's like a fairy tale, but it talks about something very human. Our need to connect, our fear of being vulnerable, how we can be selfish and loving. It's all there.
And it's not just the words, it's how the story is put together. He uses this fairy tale structure, with good guys and bad guys, but then he flips it. The giant isn't all bad, and his redemption isn't simple.
Right, he's complex. It's not a simple lesson about good and bad. It makes us ask harder questions about ourselves, about what's good and evil, about whether people can really change.
What about the ending? The giant dies. Seems sad, especially for a kid's story. But it's strangely beautiful, hopeful even, isn't it?
Absolutely. He doesn't die a tragic death. It's more like he's coming home. He's found under a tree, covered in blossoms, back with the little boy, like he's finally found peace.
Makes you think that sometimes, to really love, we have to let go of the material world. Maybe there's something more, something we can't fully understand, waiting for us when we face our fears.
Beautifully put. And it brings us back to that big question. What does it mean to be a selfish giant? Is it something we're stuck with or something we can overcome?
And if we can, how? What are the steps to go from being selfish to selfless? Those are big questions. But the selfish giant does give us some clues. Remember how the giant started changing by doing something kind for the little boy? Helping him up into the tree? Maybe that's where it starts for us, too. Making those small choices every day to reach out, to connect, to put others first.
Like planting seeds in a garden. You don't see results right away. But with time, care, those seeds grow into something beautiful. And the more we practice being generous, the more it becomes who we are.
I love that. It's not about being perfect overnight. It's about becoming more loving, more generous, little by little. It's interesting that the story never really says why the giant was so selfish to begin with.
Right.
It's like Wilde is saying that anyone could become a selfish giant if things went the wrong way.
That's a good point. It's like he's asking us to look deeper, to realize that even those who seem selfish might be hurting inside, afraid or lonely. Maybe the giant's wall was to keep pain out just as much as to keep people away.
It reminds us that we don't know what's going on in other people's hearts. Maybe instead of judging, we could try to understand more, be more compassionate. Who knows, we might help someone else tear down their walls.
And isn't that the main lesson from the selfish giant? That real joy doesn't come from being alone, but from opening up to others.
Exactly. We're all connected. Our actions affect each other. And choosing love over fear, being generous instead of greedy, well, that makes a better world for everyone.
It does. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the selfish giant,
Yeah.
I want to leave you with this thought. What walls have you built in your own life? What fears or worries are keeping you from feeling that deep joy and connection that the story talks about?
It's a challenge, isn't it? To really be honest with ourselves about how we might be holding back, keeping the world out, clinging to our own little gardens.
It is, but it's also an invitation to step outside those walls, to take a chance on being kind, to open ourselves up to change. Who knows what amazing things might be waiting for us?
That's a perfect way to end our deep dive. Always leaves you thinking.
It's been great exploring this story with you.
And thank you for joining us. We hope this has given you a new way to look at the selfish giant, to see its deeper meaning and how it relates to your own life. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and don't let those walls get too high.